2.5 miles below the Atlantic, hundreds of pairs of shoes lie perfectly arranged on the ocean floor. 2 by 2. Side by side. Each pair marks where a body decomposed and drifted away, leaving only the leather. 600 pairs. 600 people. Still lying where they died when the Titanic sank in 1912. That's number one of 7 facts they don't teach in school. And some of them are far more disturbing than how the ship went down. Because what happened that night wasn't just an accident. It was negligence, cowardice, and something far darker that historians spent decades trying to bury. Number 7. 3 weeks before the Titanic departed Southampton, a fire ignited in coal bunker 6. Not a small fire. A raging 1,000-degree inferno consuming coal deep in the ship's hull, directly behind the section where the iceberg would eventually strike. Chief Engineer Joseph Bell knew about it. Captain Edward Smith knew. J. Bruce Ismay, managing director of the White Star Line, knew. They made a decision: sail anyway. Stopping meant financial catastrophe, delayed maiden voyage, furious investors, canceled return bookings, potential bankruptcy. So 53 crew members spent the entire journey fighting that fire in shifts, hidden from passengers, working with water hoses and shovels in sweltering 120-degree heat below deck. The fire burned continuously for over 3 weeks. By the time Titanic reached the North Atlantic ice field, the steel hull plates on the starboard side had been exposed to sustained extreme heat. The metal's structural integrity was compromised, weakened, brittle. When the iceberg made contact at 11:40 p.m. on April 14th, it struck the exact area where the fire had been burning. The steel didn't bend. It didn't tear. It shattered like glass, opening a gash that flooded 6 compartments in minutes. One surviving fireman, John Dilley, testified about the blaze during British Board of Trade inquiry hearings. His testimony was buried in 800 pages of technical documentation and maritime jargon. It never made headlines. The question nobody in power wanted asked: would the Titanic have survived that iceberg impact if the hull hadn't been pre-damaged by weeks of fire? And if White Star Line executives knew about the structural damage and chose profit over safety, did they commit mass negligent homicide? But the fire wasn't the only warning. Number 6. In the 48 hours before the collision, something was wrong with the passengers. Second-class traveler Esther Hart refused to sleep. Her daughter Eva later recounted that her mother sat awake in their cabin every single night, fully dressed, clutching her coat, convinced something terrible was approaching. She wasn't alone in her premonitions. At least 17 documented passengers reported experiencing the same recurring nightmare during the voyage: drowning in ice-cold black water while watching the ship's lights sink beneath the surface. Margaret Brown, who would later become famous as the unsinkable Molly Brown, wrote in her private diary about encountering a woman in the first-class lounge who claimed she could feel death in the walls of this ship. That woman was identified in Brown's notes only as Mrs. Shebert. After the sinking, researchers tried to trace her. There was no record of anyone with that name boarding in Southampton, Cherbourg, or Queenstown. No manifest listing. No ticket purchase. No body recovered. No survivor matching her description. She appeared in multiple passengers' accounts, then vanished from history entirely as if she'd never existed. First-class passenger Colonel Archibald Gracie Ford documented in his memoir that on April 13th, the day before the iceberg, the dinner table next to his was discussing a London fortune teller who had physically refused to sell Titanic tickets to clients, claiming she saw only wooden coffins associated with the voyage. 8 of the people at that table died in the sinking. What happened in the water after Titanic went under is where this story turns into something schools will never teach. Number 5. The ship disappeared beneath the surface at 2:20 a.m. Within seconds, the screaming began. Over 1,500 people thrashing in 28-degree water, their bodies shutting down from hypothermia, their lungs seizing in the cold. The sound, survivors later testified, was like nothing they'd ever heard, a collective wailing that echoed across the flat, calm ocean for miles. And just a few hundred yards away, lifeboats sat half-empty. Lifeboat 1 had capacity for 40 people. It launched carrying 12, mostly first-class passengers and hand-picked crew. Lifeboat 6 could hold 65. It left with 23. The people in those boats could hear the screaming. They sat in the darkness and listened to it for over an hour until, one by one, the voices went silent. Lookout Frederick Fleet survived in Lifeboat 6. He testified at the American Inquiry that passengers in his boat threatened to physically throw a woman overboard when she begged them to row back for her husband. "They said we'd be swamped if we went back," Fleet recounted in his statement. "But we had room for 40 more people. We had blankets. We had space. We could hear them dying. We could hear them calling for help. And we just sat there." Fifth Officer Harold Lowe was the only officer who organized a rescue attempt. But he waited. He waited a full hour, until he was certain most people were dead, before gathering 4 other lifeboats and rowing back to search for survivors. In that frozen graveyard of bodies, they pulled 3 living people from the water. 3. Out of more than 1,500. Lowe also hauled approximately a dozen corpses into his boat, checking each one for signs of life. One woman appeared dead, skin blue, no pulse. When he lifted her to move her aside, she gasped. She survived. The others had been floating for over an hour, kept on the surface by their cork life jackets, frozen in swimming positions, their hearts stopped by hypothermia. Lowe testified that the water looked like people sleeping peacefully. But in a private letter to his sister, written years later and discovered in a London estate sale in 1998, he described something he never mentioned in official testimony. Some of the bodies weren't floating horizontally. They were standing upright in the water, held vertical by their life jackets, arms at their sides, faces tilted toward the black sky. He wrote that he rode through what felt like a forest of the dead, standing at attention in perfect rows. He never spoke publicly about it. The letter suggests it haunted him for the rest of his life. Number 4. 10 miles away, the SS Californian sat motionless, stopped for the night because of ice. Close enough to see Titanic's distress rockets exploding in the sky. Close enough that just hours earlier, Titanic's radio operator Jack Phillips had been in wireless communication with the Californian's operator, Cyril Evans. At 11 p.m., Evans transmitted an ice warning to Titanic. Phillips, overwhelmed with backlogged passenger messages he was being paid to send, responded with, shut up, I'm busy." Insulted, Evans shut down his wireless set and went to bed. 20 minutes later, Titanic struck the iceberg. The Californian's captain, Stanley Lord, was awake on the bridge. He personally witnessed Titanic's distress rockets lighting up the horizon. His second officer, Herbert Stone, counted them. 8 white rockets in total, fired at regular intervals, the international distress signal. Stone reported each one to Captain Lord. Lord's response, documented in the ship's official log: "Continue watching." Then he went to bed. For 2 hours, the Californian remained stationary while Titanic sank 10 miles away and 1,500 people died. When Lord finally ordered his ship to steam toward the coordinates the next morning, they arrived to find the Carpathia already on scene, picking up survivors from lifeboats. Lord's defense was that he believed the rockets were company signals, private communications between White Star Line ships. But maritime communication logs, presented at both the American and British inquiries, proved he'd received multiple ice warnings throughout the day describing the exact field where Titanic struck. He'd seen a massive passenger liner matching Titanic's description stop in the ice. He'd watched that ship fire 8 distress rockets. And he'd done absolutely nothing. Despite overwhelming evidence of negligence, no criminal charges were ever filed against Stanley Lord. He was quietly reassigned. He retired from the Merchant Marine with a full pension and lived to age 84. Then there's what the recovery ships found on the bodies. Number 3. The Mackay Bennett, a cable repair ship hastily converted into a floating morgue, departed Halifax on April 17 to recover victims. Over 10 days they pulled 306 bodies from the Atlantic. Most were still in their life jackets, floating face down, scattered across a 3-mile debris field. The crew photographed each body, cataloged their clothing and personal effects, and prepared them for burial or shipment to families. What they found in the pockets and belongings of first-class passengers was never fully reported to the public. John Snow, a crew member aboard the Mackay Bennett, kept a private journal throughout the recovery operation. That journal is now housed in the Maritime Museum of the Atlantic in Halifax. In its pages, Snow describes finding multiple first-class male passengers with pockets stuffed full of valuables that clearly didn't belong to them. Watches, rings, wallets, jewelry, even gold teeth wrapped carefully in linen handkerchiefs. One man's overcoat contained 16 wedding rings of different sizes. His passenger manifest description listed him as traveling alone, unmarried. Another body had a leather pouch containing loose diamonds and a collection of women's brooches. The implication was unmistakable. In the chaos and darkness of the sinking, while the ship was going down, some passengers weren't focused on survival. They were robbing the dead and the dying. The Mackay Bennett's commanding officer ordered all questionable items removed from the bodies before they were catalogued for identification. Those items were never logged, never returned to families. According to Snow's journal, they were disposed of at sea on direct orders from the captain to avoid scandal and lawsuits. The bodies themselves were divided into categories. First and second class passengers who were identifiable and whose families could pay for embalming and transport were preserved and shipped home. Third class passengers, immigrants, and anyone too decomposed or too poor to matter were given a brief service and buried at sea. 116 corpses were weighted with iron bars, sewn into canvas bags, and pushed overboard into the Atlantic. Children whose families couldn't afford the costs were dropped into the ocean alongside adults. The Mackay Bennett and subsequent recovery ships were only sent to search the area where first and second class passengers would have drifted. The currents carried the lifeboats and bodies south. The area where third class passengers most likely died, trapped below decks when the forward compartments flooded, was never searched at all. Contemporary estimates suggest over 1,000 bodies were never recovered. Most of them were steerage passengers. What the survivors reported seeing in the week after rescue doesn't appear in most historical accounts. Number 2. Multiple passengers aboard the Carpathia, the ship that responded to Titanic's distress calls and rescued 710 survivors, reported seeing figures on deck at night. Figures that shouldn't have been there. Steward Robert Vaughn, in a letter to his wife dated April 20, 1912, described a woman in a soaking wet nightgown who appeared in the third-class area on 3 consecutive nights, walking the corridors, asking passengers if they'd seen her children. She gave names, described them in detail. Each time crew members were summoned to help her, they searched the entire section. She was never found. The Carpathia's passenger manifest, cross-referenced with Titanic's survivor list, contained no woman matching her description. No one traveling with children who fit the ages she described. Survivor Eva Hart, who was 7 years old during the voyage, reported in a 1993 interview that on the second night aboard the Carpathia, she heard children singing in the cargo hold, a space that had been converted to house overflow survivors. She followed the sound down a corridor and a stairwell. When she reached the cargo hold door, the singing stopped abruptly. She tried the handle. The door was locked from the outside. When crew opened it to investigate, the space was empty. No children. No survivors housed there. The door's lock showed no signs of tampering. Multiple survivors mentioned feeling watched during the rescue voyage. Sudden cold spots in warm cabins. The sensation of someone standing behind them when no one was there. A first-class passenger named Marion Thayer wrote in a letter that she woke on the third night to find wet footprints leading from her cabin door to her bed, then stopping. She was on an upper deck. It hadn't rained. No one had entered her locked cabin. But what researchers discovered in 1985 changed everything. Number 1. When Robert Ballard's expedition finally located the Titanic's wreck using remote cameras and sonar, they found the ship broken in half. The bow section separated from the stern by roughly 2,000 feet of empty ocean floor. This confirmed what survivors had been saying for 73 years. Passengers testified in 1912 that they watched the ship snap in two before it sank. They described hearing a deafening metallic screech as the hull broke apart between the third and fourth funnels. They saw the stern rise vertically out of the water before plunging down. But the official inquiries, both American and British, concluded that the ship sank intact. Experts called survivors unreliable, traumatized, hysterical, unable to accurately observe events in the dark. For over 7 decades, history books taught that the Titanic slipped beneath the surface in one piece. Every survivor who said otherwise was dismissed as mistaken. Ballard's discovery proved they'd been telling the truth all along. But here's what most people still don't know about that wreck. Both sections, the bow and the stern, are surrounded by fields of debris, furniture, china, luggage, mechanical equipment, and shoes. Hundreds and hundreds of shoes lying in pairs on the silt. The cold temperature, immense pressure, and lack of oxygen at that depth perfectly preserved the leather. But human tissue, bone, and clothing decomposed decades ago, consumed by deep-sea organisms and bacteria. What remained were the shoes. 2 shoes side by side, marking exactly where a body came to rest on the ocean floor. Some pairs are small, children's shoes. Some are work boots. Some are expensive leather dress shoes from first-class passengers. Each pair is a person. Someone who drowned. Someone who froze. Someone who sank with the ship. Ballard's team counted over 100 visible pairs during their first survey. They stopped counting because the psychological toll on the crew became too severe. Recent sonar mapping expeditions estimate there are more than 600 pairs of shoes scattered across the debris field. 600 people still lying where they died on April 15, 1912, marked only by the footwear they were wearing when the cold Atlantic water took them. Their bodies are gone. Their names in many cases are unknown, but their shoes remain, perfectly preserved, waiting in the darkness 2.5 miles down. The wreck itself is disappearing. A rare iron-eating bacteria called Halomonas titanici is consuming the ship's structure at an accelerating rate, creating rust formations that look like icicles but are actually bacterial colonies. Scientists estimate the entire wreck will collapse into unrecognizable wreckage by 2030, possibly sooner. When it does, it will bury the evidence forever. The fire-damaged hull plating that proves White Star Line's negligence. The structural failure points that show where cost-cutting led to catastrophic weaknesses. The distribution of debris that confirms third-class passengers were trapped below with no escape. All of it will dissolve into ferric oxide sediment and vanish into the ocean floor. What they teach in schools is a simplified narrative. Unsinkable ship. Iceberg. Tragedy. What they don't teach is the 3-week fire that weakened the hull. The half-empty lifeboats that refused to go back. The captain 10 miles away who watched distress rockets and went to bed. The first-class passengers who robbed the dying in the dark. The bodies sorted by wealth and dumped overboard. The ghostly figures survivors reported on the rescue ship. And the 600 pairs of shoes still lying on the ocean floor, marking the spots where people died alone in 28-degree water that stopped their hearts in 15 minutes. The Titanic didn't just sink. It revealed exactly who we are when the lights go out and nobody's watching.